All right, welcome everybody. We're back with our guest, Chiller Queen. She came on with me some months back. We had a great conversation at that time about some of the weird true crime murders that were unexplained and unsolved. And since that time, she took a little bit of a break, but then she went back into it hardcore, and she's been covering some of the deeper, darker stuff. And she did two really deep dive good podcasts that I enjoyed listening to. One on Michael Aquino, and then her latest knowledge drop was about this recent cult within a cult situation of the Mormons. And this is a different group. It's not the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, as some of you might think. This is actually normal Mormonism, but a cult within Mormonism, the David Hamblin case, which she did super deep dives on. So we're gonna get into both of these pretty quick and pretty deep. First of all, let's go ahead and I want to ask a few questions about your Aquino podcast, because you went pretty deep in it. I covered that pretty deep a while back in a part 2 lecture. So what was your overall assessment of his role in that satanic panic period? And do you think that he was actually guilty to some degree? And we'll get into more about how the satanic panic might have been both true and exaggerated here in a little bit. But what's your overall, what did you come to with the Aquino information?
I think, as I was like diving into Michael Aquino, and, I started my series on Satanism, trying to figure out like what their belief systems are. And I, came to the realization that there's many different sects within Satanism. You have your Church of Satan that doesn't actually believe in Satan. And then Michael Aquino, which stems off of the Church of Satan. He believes in Satan, which he calls Set. And, I dove into, I did 2 parts on him. And the first part, I really just dove into the Temple of Set and their belief systems, which are kind of hard for you to figure out what their belief system is, because they keep it so secret. But when I started, they talk about how they, really their belief system, it was really hard for me to dive in and find that they were doing anything like harming children, ritualistic abuse, or any of that kind of stuff according to them. But then I kind of stumbled upon the Presidio daycare abuse scandal. And that stemmed out of the satanic panic, is kind of what you were talking about. And when I started really analyzing that stuff, I came to the realization that, whether Michael Aquino was involved or not, because he seems to, he was stationed at the Presidio military base. He was in San Francisco. He did recruit other military people to do these rituals with him and, get them on board with his religion. And then you have these children who are going to the Presidio daycare, which is on the military base, and they're all of a sudden coming out and talking about how they were being ritualistically abused and that they were being taken off their out of the daycare and brought to other places, and they were being photographed and they were being abused. And one of the young kids talked about how she was abused by two people called Mikey and Shamby, and she identified them with her father at a store when they were out shopping. And so, there's a lot of pieces that corroborate each other when you look into this case. Some of the kids talk about how they were abused in a room with dark walls and it was all black. And when the police went into Michael Aquino's home, they found a black soundproof room. So, a lot of the stuff that the children reported seeing, they were finding evidence inside of Michael Aquino's home. One of the children went with a couple of the investigators to the vicinity of where Michael Aquino lived, and they walked with the investigators to try and see if this little girl, who was only like 3 years old at the time, could identify where Michael Aquino lived, and she was able to actually identify where he lived. And so when you look at that, and then you also find that there was evidence that abuse did happen to some of these children. You had the hospital who evaluated some of these children stated that yes, these children had been abused in
Yeah.
some way, and that they had, some of them even contracted STDs. You know, children don't just contract STDs. And so you kind of piece all that together, and you kind of have to, I mean, I presume that somehow he is involved. Um, I don't know how he's involved, but unless there's some orchestrated thing that happened with the parents behind the scenes trying to, frame this guy or something like that because they didn't like him. But there's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that, these children did see him in some capacity and that he was
Yeah.
involved in some way.
Yeah, I remember too. I think wasn't there a similar situation in the McMartin case? Did you go into that one at all?
I didn't do a deep dive into that one.
I think there was something to do with children that had STDs in that as well. But then when the FBI declassified those documents, they did admit that there were tunnels, which the mainstream media had said forever was made up. That, oh, there's no tunnels. That's all a bunch of crazy. No, but there actually were. And the documents they declassified, 3 or 4 years ago, admitted that. So a lot of times, yeah, we find out that the details in these stories are actually sometimes correct. In other words, the so-called conspiracy theories are correct, but there's also this tendency to kind of go wild with it, which, after not just the McMartin case and the Presidio situation, but also Geraldo focused on a lot of wacky stuff when he did his famous series that helped kick off. I don't know if I've actually watched all those. I think they're on YouTube, but it actually helped kick off the sensationalism of the Satanic Panic and made it all kind of look ridiculous. Which, in my view, that was partly there on purpose to do that. I'm not saying that Geraldo is a Satanist. I don't know that, but I'm saying at least he probably just wanted clicks, and views and all of that. But it does seem to be that the truth typically lies somewhere in the middle. Did you ever get a chance to read any of Aquino's writings? I read his book on black magic, and he wrote a famous thing called From Mind War to Psy War. Have you ever read that paper?
Mm-mm.
It's pretty wild. I recommend reading it. It's not that long. It's about 15, 20 pages. It's actually a scholarly essay written together with another colonel on the Army's psychological warfare doctrine. And he kind of changed where the Army would go with psychological warfare when he wrote that paper. So he had quite a bit of influence. And I mean, you can read that he does. I mean, he very much believes in utilizing sorcery and black magic for psyops. I don't mean that he literally thinks he's doing magic rituals, but the principles behind what a sorcerer does, he's basically saying that the Army should do in psychological warfare. So that's what he argues in the black magic. Yeah, it's pretty wild. But there's another podcast too where he mentions that there's an interview with him where he talks about working on some things that might have been related to MK Ultra, and he mentions working with studying the UFO phenomenon. And I'm curious if you noticed any of the connections with, Johnny Gosh is.
Hmm. Yeah, I mentioned him in
Yeah, I thought you did. Okay.
the episode. Yeah.
What was your take on that?
I mean, when I went down the Johnny Gosh rabbit hole, it just got muddied after a little while because um I think that I mean everything got kind of sensationalized. I don't know where this is the hard part that I have is that when I go down these rabbit holes, the more sensational the claims get and the more people who get involved in some of these claims, and sometimes it's hard to identify what is real and what isn't real. And so, when I read how Noreen Gosh, who's Johnny Gosh's mother, claimed that Johnny Gosh is still alive and that he came to her later on in his life basically to come back and say that I'm doing okay, but basically that he had
Yes,
gotten
I heard that
yeah, that he
podcast where
had
she
gotten
says that.
trafficked,
Yep.
and she wrote a book on this, and that Michael Aquino was the one who actually purchased Johnny Gosh for I think $35,000 from this trafficking ring. Um, you know, a, a lot of people gave credibility to that, but then sometimes it's like some of the circle around that has is kind of like very far out there in some of their belief systems, and so it's kind of hard to identify where the delusion ends and begins. And so um the Johnny Gosh, case is bizarre in and of itself. But the fact that the mom even came in and started writing a book about it and that she saw Johnny Gosh and all this kind of stuff. I haven't actually dove super deep into the Michael Aquino ties on that. I just know that she wrote a book saying that, Michael Aquino had purchased him for $35,000. And he was the one who was the first boy on the milk carton who went missing.
Correct. Yeah. The
Yeah.
the reason he connects is because of when they interrogate, or excuse me, when they did the legal questioning of Paul Bonacci, and we know Paul Bonacci was trafficked and involved in these things. He was one of the procurers, and it's Bonacci that specifically identifies Aquino as well. And those lawyer depositions, I guess, is what they are. Those are still on YouTube. I don't know if you've ever seen those. I'll send you the Paul Bonacci questioning, where the lawyers are questioning him, and that was used in the court. I don't think that anything ever came of it, but if I recall, the writers who write on the Franklin scandal, they'll often cite that to draw the connection between Gosh and Aquino. It's Paul Bonacci that's the connecting figure, and Paul Bonacci was involved in procuring boys. So now, just because he says that, doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, I think Paul Bonacci is a key figure there that you should look at. One thing I
There is
noticed.
one
Yeah, go ahead.
there is one thing that I noticed, when I started going down that rabbit hole with Noreen Gosh and trying to, they were talking about how there was a lot of, I think it led me to like a bunch of MK Ultra sex slaves that kind of came out and started reporting that they had been part of this sex trafficking ring and that they were programmed to be sex slaves. One MK Ultra sex slave that came forth and gave their whole story about what they remember, what happened to them, their previous, what led up to it, and et cetera, et cetera. Then they interviewed the sisters of this MK Ultra victim, and a lot of the stuff that the MK Ultra victim was saying was not accurate to
Yes.
what the
Right.
other girls were saying. And as I started like really diving deep into a lot of these victims that come forth who are a victim of this, I started recognizing that, some of them truly, truly believe in what they are stating of what
Yep.
has been done to them, but there's not the supporting evidence. And
And
so
and
it,
and they sometimes say really outlandish stuff.
yes. And so I kind of came to this realization that I think this is, if they're being programmed or they're being, hypnotized or whatever it is, these things are being placed into their minds intentionally to, whether it's real or fake, we don't know what's real and what's fake and what they're remembering. And I think that's done intentionally to
Right.
kind of muddy the waters. And that's the same thing in what I'm finding with this David Hamblin case as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's you hit the nail on the head as to where I was going. We did a podcast, Frank and I, my buddy over at Quite Frankly TV. We did a chat on this a couple weeks ago. We kind of came to the same sort of conclusion that you were coming to, and when I listened to your Sam Tripoli Hamlin discussion, because it seems like they figured out probably a long time ago that in these cases of ritual abuse, the best way to diffuse the possibility of people spilling the beans or remembering these suppressed memories was to have these kinds of already pre-installed wacky things, right? I think even Bonacci, if I recall, says something like he feels like when they when he was under Aquino that they would take him and show him things that he knew weren't real. Like he saw what was supposed to be aliens, and I don't believe in aliens, but remember that Aquino is working in, according to his own testimony and on podcasts, mind control studies for the military and UFO blue book type stuff, according to Aquino. So it's plausible that if he was involved in that, he would have been adept enough to install a kind of failsafe in the in the victims. And I think a couple of the victims themselves, who I think again, and I don't mean this to be negative to those people, because a lot of times if you don't immediately believe everything they say, these people will get really mad at you. And it's not that I'm trying to discount what you're saying. It's just that I can't, and as you're saying, Avery, that you can't verify everything they're saying. There's no way for us to know that everything you're saying is true. Like, I was taken to an underground base and there was little green men down there, and they were engineering them and making them into clones. And it's like, okay, but that's probably not true, right? That's unlikely. Right. So that was probably, I mean, Bonacci says that he thinks they were doing that to make the testimony less credible.
Yes. And that's why I think this whole
I lost your microphone. Can you hear me? So your sound went out. Can you hear me still? Yeah. Maybe come out and come back in. You want to try that? Like, click the link, click out of the link, and then come back into the link and see what happens. So yeah, I think as we're waiting for her to come back, I think it makes sense that you would have these kind of like program fail safes if you really wanted to. There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, you're back. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. No, I mean, that's exactly kind of when you have, I mean, you can only imagine, like, if you're trying to keep an organization or something that you're doing secret, um, I mean, if you know how to use psychological techniques against people and, use abuse and do all these different types of things and get people to, I mean, it's not impossible to get people to have false memories, plant false memories. Just the way that the mind works and how memories work. I mean, you would want, like, if somebody were to come forth and say that they had been abused by you, you would want there to be all this crazy stuff that they're saying so that it makes it really hard to believe their testimony. And that's kind of like what I'm finding in a lot of these, claims, because with some of the children in the Presidio Daycare Center, some of the claims were very sensational and could be debunked. And so it was hard to look at some of the other stuff that they were saying and be able to prosecute that, because from a prosecutor's standpoint, if you were to go in and they're saying, like, they've killed boys, they've sacrificed X, Y, and Z, they've done all this stuff, you don't just have a sexual abuse charge, you now have a murder charge, you have all these other charges that have to be brought forth in court. And how are you going to do that when half of them doesn't have supporting evidence to be proven? And so if you have that, then how are you going to believe this person when it comes to the abuse charges? It's like, I think it's done very strategically. And so when you listen to a lot of the abuse claims, no matter where you are, a lot of them sound very similar. Um,
Exactly. That I mean, what you were saying about Presidio reminded me of a lot of the stuff that was said about the McMartin case, and we will see is also with the Hamlin case.
mhm.
One other thing I was thinking too is it reminds me of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. If you look into that, that was actually founded to combat the satanic panic, right? So, and I do think there are, cases of people legitimately having false memories. They think that something happened, or you can have a situation where an overactive therapist suggests to a person under hypnosis or regression that, oh, this may have happened to you. Are you sure you weren't abused, right? And then the person can actually invent stories of abuse. So that does occur. However, the guy that created the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, Martin T. Orn, ended up being a convicted creep and was working with the CIA to set up the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which shows that they do actually study implantation of false memories, debunking legitimate memories, right? How to manipulate people is what I'm getting at. Had you
Yeah.
heard about Orrin and all that?
I heard a little bit about that, but I didn't like look super deep into that. But I do know, obviously, I've studied a lot into like MK Ultra and then
Yeah.
hypnosis, false memories, all that kind of stuff. And the one thing that really stood out to me was following the Brett Bluth victim statement in the David Hamblin case, because he detailed um, every single appointment that he had with David Hamblin and how he got him to get to the point that he did. Now, in the end, he never ended up believing what David Hamblin had stated. Well, at a point he did, but the way that he got him to do that, he was very strategic on how he got Brett Bluth to believe that he was satanically and ritually abused. He under hypnosis, he would show him, symbolic pictures, and these symbolic pictures were, maybe like satanic imagery. And there was one time where so for a long time, Brett Bluth did not believe that he was satanically ritually abused by his parents or anything like that. But David Hamblin would tell him that when he was under hypnosis, he had confessed all of these things. He's like, I'm being ritually abused by some satanic cult, X, Y, and Z, told him all the stories. But Brett Bluth was like, no, I'm awake this whole time. I don't remember ever telling you any of that kind of stuff. And then he would say, well, you wouldn't remember because you were under hypnosis. And so there was one time where Brett Bluth increasingly got more depressed, and he woke up one morning and he had this symbol carved in his body. And he had actually carved it himself. He had went the next day to an appointment with David Hamblin, and he's like, I carved this symbol into my arm. I don't know what it is. And I'm just like super depressed and I don't know why I did this. And he goes, oh, well, that's interesting. I have another patient who just came in who was who's being ritually abused from a satanic cult. And she had shown me this image, and he pulled out his book and the image was in there. And he said, see, like, you must be remembering some things. Some things might be bubbling up and you're like taking it out on yourself. Well, he came to the conclusion later that David Hamblin had shown him that symbol under hypnosis previous to that. And that is why he carved that symbol into him. Well, that was the turning point for Brett Bluth, because he thought, oh, wow, now I'm kind of believing that I have been satanic, like ritually abused, because I have this symbol in here. And now he's showing me that one of his other patients who's been abused
Mm-hmm.
has this symbol. And so maybe I can believe what David Hamblin is saying now. And so he started to believe that he was ritualistically abused. And then after that, after he gained the trust of David Hamblin, then David Hamblin came to him and was like, well, you know how we fix this, right? Well, you have to take in the semen of a righteous man. So that's how he introduced the sexual abuse, was that he first kind of worked him up through hypnosis and suggestion to get him to believe that he had been abused. And
Oh,
because,
interesting.
yeah, so because he was satanically abused by men, is what David Hamblin would say, that was the reason why he was struggling with homosexuality, because he was there to try and get rid of his homosexuality because he was Mormon. And so he was trying to say, well, you're not really gay. You just were abused by some men in a satanic cult. So you think you're gay. But so now you have to take in the semen of a righteous man in order to get rid of it, you know?
Yeah,
So
that sounds like a form of sex magic. So let's rewind a little bit, because I want you to kind of introduce everybody to the bigger picture of this case. And for those that don't know, Chiller Queen is our guest, and her podcast is linked in the show description. She's also gotten the actual, court documents and read through this, so she's not coming from speculation. So people are saying, "Why don't you get so and so on?" Well, because I heard her podcast, and she did a really good coverage of this with our buddy Sam Tripoli. So I wanted to have a conversation with her about it, because it ties in perfectly with what we just talked with Frank about the other night on his show. One last thing about that is that in the Satanic Panic, one of the key books that was propping up the whole phenomena was the famous Michelle Remembers book, which I actually read back in the day. I read it many years ago, and it's weird because I remember reading through her story, and it was very believable. And then at the end, they insert this really outlandish appendix where she explains how they actually like talk to the devil directly, and I don't remember if she says like a devil phone, or I mean, it's just, it got really absurd, right? So you read this whole story, and then it's the very end, it's like this ridiculous appendix that's obviously not true. And then it turns out the Michelle Remembers woman ended up running off with her therapist, and so it seemed like it was kind of a grift, and she was just like sensationalizing, but that debunking of Michelle Remembers, again, I think was kind of one of these scenarios where, I mean, she could have been completely grifting and all made up. It all been made up, but it's another example of how, okay, there really were cases. I mean, let me give you another example of real abuse where one of the people that Geraldo focuses on in his series that kicked off the Satanic Panic was the serial killer Bobby Berdella. And Bobby Berdella is pictured as being a Satanist because he had a skull on his he had a bizarre items shop, right, like at a pawn shop where he sells, I don't know, skulls and shit, right? Mm-hmm. And so Geraldo's like, look at the Satanist, he's got a skull, right, which is ridiculous. But it turns out that, I mean, just having like, little voodoo skulls or whatever doesn't necessarily make you a Satanist. But it turns out he actually was a serial killer, right? But and he actually did have like his own little satanic cult going. But it wasn't the stuff that Geraldo was talking about, right? So it was just silly. So there's another case of like misinformation here, and we can move over now into this case that is a perfect example of what we're getting at here, with the truth is sort of in the middle between the crazy sensationalism and then the total denial debunkers who say it doesn't exist. What is the overall of this recent Hamblin case? It's I only saw certain, it was in the news, it was in the media, but I only saw certain people covering it. It seems like a huge story to me. What's the basics of it?
Well, I mean, it is a big story, but he got arrested in March of 2022. And he initially got arrested in 2012 after both of his daughters came forth saying that they were ritualistically and sexually abused by not only him, but their mother, as well as their grandparents, their aunts, uncles, and friends of David Hamblin, as well as some of his associates, some prominent business people in Utah, and people in the Mormon church, bishops, stake presidents. It included a lot of really high profile people in Utah. And so when that came out, he got arrested, and inevitably it got dismissed because they couldn't really prove a lot of the claims that they were saying. They knew that something had happened because even at that time in 2012, the daughter put a wiretap on herself and she went to go, they were trying to get evidence to get him to admit that he had raped them so that they could put him in jail. And so she puts a wiretap on herself and she goes and she confronts her dad and she asks him, why did you rape me? And he says, and this is just crazy, he says, "I'm sorry for raping you. I'm not going to say that it didn't happen, but it didn't happen for me. It was something inside of my body." So he basically admits that he did rape her on camera. But even that, they couldn't prosecute him because all the claims were just so sensational that they couldn't get enough evidence so they basically dismissed the case without prejudice, meaning that they could open it up at a later date if they collected enough evidence. So they let him go in 2014 and they continued to investigate the case. Well, after that investigation happened, more people started coming forth to kind of corroborate the daughter's statement, saying that they were victims. So more victims started coming forth. And then um, basically, these allegations started during the Satanic Panic era. So it was in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was out of Provo, Utah. And so he gets arrested in 2022. They obviously found enough evidence. His wife finally gets arrested in August of this year. And they make a press conference and they talk about how more arrests are going to start happening. So they're working on this case. So the case is still in court. It's being worked on. And basically, what the victim statements claim is that there is this secret LDS Church of Satan that is operating within the Mormon church. So it's not the Mormons, but they disguise themselves as Mormons. They also are part of the Native American church. They're part of these polygamy groups. And they detail very specifically like the mythology, the doctrine of this LDS Church of Satan. They talk about the different ceremonies of this church. They talk about the different ceremonies that they were a part of, what they remember. They talk about sacrificing children from Indian like reservations, as well as these polygamous groups where none of the children are documented. Um, and they talk about how, some of the people who are part of this LDS church, the reason why nothing has been charged or people haven't been able to find them out is because these people are positioned in very strategic positions in society to basically, like, if something were to occur, that they're positioned, like you have the Utah County attorney or prosecutor, you have the stakes presidents of some of the Mormon churches, you have
They can
bishops.
shut it down in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
There's people that are there to shut it down.
Exactly. And so that's basically basically the biggest part is that David Hamblin right now is the first person who's kind of the one in the limelight right now. He's the one who's been arrested. He's the one who's kind of the front person that's being charged with this stuff. But when you look at the case, this is like a huge organization.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently they're part of human trafficking, international human trafficking. And so I've just been kind of going through and taking all the people who are alleged to be members of this, and I've just been doing super deep dives on them, trying to connect the dots. And it's been really interesting what I found.
Now, that is going to be available for subscribers to your stuff. The people that are interested, they can go to her podcast, her Rockfin, and get access to the full talks. First question I have is, in your research of this, and you're talking about right now, it's at the stage where you're going through the people's accounts of what happened, right? So only one guy's kind of been taking the heat so far.
Right.
Is he charged with anything yet, or has he just been arrested?
He has been charged,
Okay.
and he's in jail. He actually got bail. He's not in jail right now. He actually got bail. So when he went to jail, there was a huge petition going out in Utah because everyone knows that this man has abused people in the public. I mean, he lost his psychology license. He was a He was a licensed psychologist, and he was
That's
having
important
sex.
too, right there. Yeah.
Yes, and he was very good at programming and hypnosis, and everyone knew that he was because they would bring their children to him to help with like any type of issues that they had. Like when
Yeah.
that guy said that he was experiencing homosexuality, the bishop referred him to David Hamblin to get that gone, through hypnosis, et cetera, et cetera. But he was actually having sex with multiple patients of his, and Brett Bluth being one of them. Brett Bluth was the one who actually forced him to go to Doppel, who's the people who hold the license for psychologists, and admit that he was having sex with his patients, which inevitably ended in him losing his license. There's also been reports of other victims that have come forth talking about him abusing them as well. So there's tons of reports that support the evidence that this man has been abusing people.
Yeah.
And so there was a huge petition that came out after he got arrested to not allow him to get bail. Well, they did give him bail and he got bail. So basically, he's on house arrest right now with an ankle bracelet. And it's the same with his wife, Roselle. And so basically, the court's been going on right now trying to get through it. But there's a lot of other players involved. And one of the biggest things in this case is the programming. Because when the daughters tried to confront their mom about abusing them, their mom stated that she didn't remember anything at all. She didn't remember abusing them. She didn't remember how she could even do something like that to her children, but she said, I do know that David's really good at programming. So maybe he programmed me and I don't remember. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's crazy. Now, first one question I have is, do the victims and the people who you've read through their accounts, do they claim that it's a more recent inner cult, or do they claim that this has been there for a long time, like multi-generational type of thing?
They claim this is multi-generational. They actually they claimed in their victim statement that this stems all the way back to the second prophet of the Mormon religion. Um, and I think it was Oliver Crowder, Crowder,
That makes sense.
who was the second, person baptized into the Mormon religion. You have Joseph Smith, and then you have him, and they said it stems all the way back to him as where this all stemmed from.
One note I would, for the audience, a lot of my audience might not know this. So I was actually supposed to debate one of the top Mormons several years ago, and so I had to do a bunch of research on Mormonism, which at that time I didn't know a lot about. I'm not a Mormon expert, but I know a decent amount of it because I was preparing for several weeks for this debate. And it was the guy that was going to be Mitt Romney's. It was when Romney was running. It was Mitt Romney's faith and values guy. We were going to have this debate. He ended up backing out like the 2 or 3 days before the debate, but I got really deep into studying the history of Mormonism for this debate. And I think that it is the case, as my understanding. And there's at least one Mormon systematic theology by Talmage, and he discusses a lot of the actual theology, which is not anything really like Christian theology or Catholic theology or Orthodox Christian theology. It's a very Gnostic kind of space opera where Jesus is kind of one of many gods. God the Father is a God with a body, and he impregnates Mary. It's this wild kind of space opera. But I say all that because they have this idea of they really stress bloodlines, and so it makes perfect sense to me that this would be the case within Mormonism, because a lot of religions, as you know, you talked about this with Tripoli, there's like a public version of the religion, and then at times there's like an inner secret core of it that
not even a lot of Mormons know.
Yeah, exactly. And that inner group is like a secret Gnostic group that's doing like crazy cult stuff, right? I mean, I think this exists in Protestant world, it exists in the Catholic world. I mean, this is why you have these networks of, PEDO priests and pastors. It exists in a lot of different groups where people have access to kids, and they can hide under the cloak of piety and being a preacher and a minister, right? So But think about Mormonism here, just in terms of the public. Well, maybe not all the Mormons, people don't actually know Mormons believe this, but they actually do have this traditional polygamy teaching. It's a very libertarian idea of we don't want to be under the state, so we want to have our own way of doing things. I'm not saying that the state's good, but I'm saying that sometimes people have the motivation of not wanting to be connected to the state so that they can do these kinds of activities, under more cover, right? Does that make sense, what I'm saying? So I think,
Yeah.
it makes perfect sense that there's an inner group. It was probably all that way. The older traditional teachings of Mormonism were absolutely things like blood atonement. Have you heard of that? Where you actually have to yeah. So polygamy is there. It bears so many parallels to Islam and the rise of Muhammad and the actual transmission of what happened in Muhammad's lineage, because a lot of the Islamic sects are divided on whether they follow the prophet and his successors, right? Just like in Mormonism, the same thing. It's kind of like a sex cult, basically, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and I honestly didn't realize how there's even a conspiracy surrounding polygamy within Mormon religion. And I mean, I knew that there was polygamy that was part of the Mormon religion. I didn't know how it was part of it because I didn't know a ton about, the history of the Mormon church. And so I started diving in, and I was hearing two different narratives coming from Mormons. And I didn't realize that there's this own group of people who believe that Joseph Smith was never a polygamist and that he never believed in polygamy and that he was set up by Oliver Crowder, from the beginning. He kind of set the he created a rumor basically that Joseph Smith was had multiple wives, or that he was having an affair with his I think it's his housekeeper or maid or something. Um, and he wasn't okay with that. And so, you know, apparently, like, all the other leaders in the church heard that and started teaching polygamy to the people. And Joseph Smith got really upset about that and started excommunicating some of these leaders for committing polygamy. And this was a year before he died. He even wrote in his journal that man and woman there should be only one woman to a man, and that he was against polygamy and all this stuff. And there's two different writings in his journal that state that. But then after he died, that there was this massive cover up by the leaders, even by his scribe, to go in and edit those journal entries. And there's, screenshotted proof of these edits that were made on his journal. And then basically all the leaders came back and started to try and take over the doctrine and administer polygamy into the doctrine and change some of the stuff that Joseph Smith said and make it part of the LDS doctrine. That's one of the conspiracies. And then you have the other one where it's like, no, Joseph Smith had all these wives and he was a polygamist, and he was part of this secret cult and all this kind of stuff. So I don't know which side to believe, because I know that the polygamy aspect of this LDS Church of Satan is a huge part of it because of the bloodlines. They were very
Exactly.
big on the incestuous relationships, making the purity of the bloodlines. And so, they didn't want to go outside of their faith. And so, in the beginning, there wasn't much opportunity outside. So they kind of inbred with each other and they promoted polygamy, et cetera, et cetera. And it was like, that's why you have all these offshoots of like polygamists and fundamental polygamists and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. I was going to say the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, that Warren Jeffs, remember when that was a big news story and they were talking about how he was, clamping down on his compound brides. And you said Oliver Crowder. It made me think about, what if it was Oliver Anthony that was the polygamist? I've been working all day trying to feed 20 wives. I'm so tired of that Oliver Anthony song.
Beautiful.
You know what I'm talking about, right? Oliver Anthony, that song that everybody's been playing like nonstop for the last 3 months.
I'm terrible keeping up with music.
Well, he's the guy that went viral all over the internet because he was singing about the working man's plight. And
Yes.
so you kept saying Oliver Crowder, and I was like, that reminds me of that one guy, Oliver Anthony, that guy. Anyway, that was a silly joke, but so the other thing too is this is why they have the largest genealogy library, is because Mormonism is very obsessed with lineage and bloodline, and they also believe that you baptize for all of your dead descendants, right? And so, no, in order to baptize for all of your dead descendants, you need to know your descendants. So they have this
Mm-hmm.
ritual where you're baptized for all of the dead, which I think is also very bizarre. But the rituals within the temple, which very few people actually are able to see, you have to get to like a certain level. They're all kind of borrowed from various aspects of Freemasonry, and even this is so common that even the Mormons have to kind of explain it and comment on it. Sort of like, look, I mean, your temples on the outside of the temple actually have Masonic symbolism on the Mormon temples. So
Mm-hmm.
clearly, Joseph Smith, I think, was doing a patchwork job of kind of creating his own religions. He was taking from Freemasonry, taking from Christianity, importing his own weird elements, because he has this story of kind of going through all the denominations. And he
Mm-hmm.
says, I didn't know which one was right, so I went and prayed in the woods. And the angel moron. I mean, it's very
Yeah,
close to
Moroni. I
moron.
thought it was Moroni.
I've always thought he was
You know,
trolling
but
by that name of the angel that appears to him.
Moroni.
Yeah, right. And then you get the plates and this wild mythology, and the ultimate theology, though, is very totally Gnostic when you get into the deeper inner core of it. So it would not surprise me that if it has, in fact, this inner group and cult, and if this goes all the way up to the top. There also have been over the years many cases of church corruption in the Mormon Church with high level, because they're a corporation, right? Like they own
Mm-hmm.
giant
They're the
stock, and
richest
yes,
church.
yeah, they
They're
have giant
extremely
pieces
wealthy.
of stock. They used to own like half of like Pizza Hut and Pepsi and Taco, or big chunks of Pepsi and Taco Bell. And I always thought that was odd because Mormons are supposedly against caffeine, but they
Yeah.
own a bunch of Pepsi, so it's kind of hypocritical. But all right, so back to the Hamblin case. Now, one thing you said that as you were getting into this that kind of blew me away was you were talking about, at one point, it might have been the woman that you were saying. She said something about, oh well, the way we viewed it was something would enter you in these rituals, and so it wasn't me doing it; it was something in me.
Mm-hmm.
Was there some statement like that?
Yeah, David. It was David Hamblin himself when the daughter confronted him about
Oh, yeah,
why
yeah.
did you rape me, and he was like, "I'm not saying it didn't happen, but what I'm saying is it was something inside of me." Now, something crazy, because this is something I haven't actually come out and said in the about the victim statements yet. Because I'm still have so many episodes to do on this because there's so much I'm covering. And I've already put 5 episodes out, but in the victim statement, she talks about how the girls would be driving in the car and he would turn on some rock music. It was like heavy metal, and he would turn into a different person. He would start, like, his eyes would turn different. It was almost like he was getting ready for something, and he'd start turning like really dark, and he just looked really angry. And the girls knew that something really bad was going to happen. And so he'd be driving in the car listening to this music, and he'd start growling. And when they'd get to the house, he would say, "Run." He'd give them a head start. They would run out of the car, and then he'd get out and start howling and barking and running after them. And he'd turn into a completely different person.
Hmm.
And there was another instance. They talk about Bible studies. This is one of the ceremonies that they say that happens. And what happens is they bring all the people over, the alleged members, for a Bible study, and they would go through different types of scriptures, which included the Book of Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Mormon scripture. But they would just exchange the name God with Lucifer or Satan, and they would have one person who they called the designated driver, and this person would remain unpossessed, meaning that all the other members in the group would call on these entities to possess them and then act out their deeds. But the unpossessed had to make sure that things didn't get too crazy or out of hand, and would also have to call out the demons from the people at the end to bring them back to normal. So that was the two instances where they talk about how, these entities come into their body. They also use voodoo dolls and, talking to, uh, you know, dead people and, sorcery and all that kind of stuff. But those were the instances where it's almost like they use these little triggers. They have like these rituals that they use before they turn into something different. And it just kind of reminded me of the Jeffrey Dahmer thing, where he turns on
Yeah.
The Exorcist 3 to get him into
Yeah.
a certain mood in order to kill people and turns into a different person. Um, and
Well,
so,
this is part a lot of voodoo is this way where there's a certain point in the ritual where you're hyping yourself up and then, the entity is in you and then their eyes roll back and they don't remember what's happened when they come out of that ecstatic state, post voodoo. So
yeah,
they might have been humping around, they might have been falling over and, having convulsions. They don't know because they were basically in a dissociative state. So I'm curious, was this believed to be something that he could induce, or did they have drugs? Like, was it purely hypnosis, or was he using drugs as well?
there was drugs as well. So he got super a part of the Native American church with James Mooney, who wasn't even Native
Oh,
American.
that's where we get the drugs. Oh,
Yeah,
interesting. Okay.
Aklavaya Native American Church, I believe, in Utah. He wasn't even a Native American. I think he was kicked out of a lot of other Native American churches because he wasn't doing things like they were. And so he created his own Native American church. And David Levitt, after he got his license taken away, he decided he was going to start helping people with healing
Yeah.
ceremonies through the Native American church using the psychedelic drug
Yes.
or peyote.
Right.
um, and so he would use these during the healing ceremonies, and he would administer that to the people there who were there to kind of get healing from abuse or whatever it was. And there was another victim statement that talked about how during one of the ceremonies, she remembered she took peyote and she completely, like, it didn't hit her crazy hard like some of the other people. So she was aware, but she was still kind of in this weird mode. And David Hamblin had tried to convince her that her father was ritualistically abusing her and was part of a satanic cult. And she was like, "No, I don't think so." And he was like, "Yeah, yeah, you were." And was trying to get her convinced that she was. And then he made her stand up in front of the group and say that she was sodomized by her father and, getting her to admit to all of these things that never happened to her. And she said that, she felt this dark force crawl up her leg into her groin, and she felt like this was more of some satanic ritual than a healing ceremony, and it freaked her out, and she left, and she had to have the bishop do a cleanse on her because she felt like this dark entity wouldn't leave her. And it wasn't until after that that it went away, but she was one of the victims who came forth and discussed, what she had witnessed. And during that ceremony, I guess he was doing the same thing to other people and was getting them to believe that they had been ritualistically abused. And so she was like witnessing that. So those were the two aspects that I saw, where it was like I saw victim statements where they were stating that he was trying to manipulate them, use psychological tactics to make them believe that they were being ritualistically abused from some satanic cult. And then I also heard from their daughters who 100% believe in all this stuff that has happened to them. And it's hard to identify what actually happened, because
So there's a possibility that there isn't actually an inner satanic cult, but that Hamblin was using this story to rope people into his own personal coom fest, basically, right?
well, the thing that I'm starting to get to in understanding all of this is I think that maybe this isn't a satanic cult per se, but some sort of organized group of people who abuse children or abuse
And
people
they
or
use
looking to.
whatever, like they use peyote, they'll use mind control, they'll use anything. Is that what you think?
I think I think yes, because there are so many situations that are tied to these victim statements where they corroborate some of the positions that these people play in society. So you have David Levitt, for example. David Levitt was the Utah County attorney at the time, In 2020, he basically outed himself in a press conference that he was part of this 151-page victim statement, and that it included him and his wife as being part of the satanic cult. When I went to go and dive into David Levitt's past, there were some very sketchy things about his involvement with, like, he tried to do a adoption, an illegal adoption of a Native American child, and tried to use a barter of a buffalo in order to exchange it for the child. He also tried to do another illegal adoption by exchanging a car
A
for the
buffalo?
adoption.
How many buffalo? What's the kid to buffalo ratio on the market? Like what?
I have no
Are
idea.
you saying a literal actual buffalo?
Yes, and this was happened in Ukraine. So he tried to basically barter a buffalo to this Native American reservation in Ukraine
Oh, I see. Okay.
in exchange for a Native American child. And there was also another adoption where he tried to exchange a car with the adoption agency, and then he took the car back. Um, and then there's also, like, he was making a shit ton of money and decides that he's going to leave the Mormon Tabernacle Choir to go work for $8.50 an hour at Delta Airlines. And while he's a county attorney, and he gave the excuse that he wanted free flights. And I'm just like, that's kind of odd because you make a shit ton of money. And then he turned around and put $300,000 towards his own campaign because he was running for the state's attorney general office in Utah against Sean Reyes. And the Department of Homeland Security also was investigating him for human trafficking charges. There's like so much sketchy
So
stuff in his past.
you think it definitely does it does signal that there is a network at least of this stuff going on. How
Yes.
serious they believe in Satan is unclear, but they're using at least the cult tactics to do this stuff, right?
Yeah. And have you looked into the Jody Hildebrandt case that just came out of Utah?
I'm not familiar with that now.
So it's a huge case going on right now. So Ruby Frank just got arrested for child abuse. And the person that she got arrested with was Jody Hildebrandt. Ruby Frank is out of Spring City, Provo, Utah, the same area that David Hamblin's from. They're all Mormon, they're LDS. Jody Hildebrandt is part of that same unit, except for she lives a few hours away. The more that I'm diving into that case, it has so many parallels to the David Hamblin case as well. She was a psychologist. She was treating a bunch of patients, making them believe that they were addicted to porn, making them believe that they were addicted to masturbation, making them believe that they were child abusers. She was tearing families apart. She was abusing children. She was taping them up with duct tape. She was there was like so much stuff in that case that keeps coming up, and it's all in that same area, and it's all tied to the LDS church. And so whether this is like an LDS Church of Satan group that's operating within there, or if this is just something that has grown within the Mormon church because of some of the policies and the institutional policies that have been set up in the Mormon church to protect abusers, and some of their doctrine, which kind of plays into some of this wild, crazy
Yeah, exactly.
strictness. I don't know if it's like creating this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, something else popped in my head. Remember the disappearance and reappearance of Elizabeth Smart? Wasn't that a Mormon thing too?
Yes. Okay. Um, Interesting part about that, because I have been researching into Tim Ballard. A lot of people, I don't want to go too deep into that because it's a really touchy subject with people lately. But even Elizabeth Smart had come up and wanted to be a part of the human trafficking organization Operation Underground Railroad, and she was put on the board of Operation Underground Railroad. and she never made a public statement on why she left, but she went in there and she saw some things, and then she decided to back out of Operation Underground Railroad. Never made a statement as to why, but there was, there's just some interesting connections and names that keep running throughout all of these groups.
Now, in her case, I'm trying to remember. I don't remember all the details. She was just taken when she was young, right, by some guy. Was he connected? Was he just a random dude, supposedly, or was he part of the LDS cult? I don't remember. Do you know her story? I've just forgotten.
I don't remember. I know her story, but I don't remember him specifically, his story, if he's like tied to the
Yeah.
LDS church.
It just does. It just seems like FLDS. I mean, there's so many of these weird things going on with this that like it's super sus. Is what I'm saying. So,
Well, even some of the victims that I've been listening to with the Jody Hildebrandt, they talk about how they specifically, grew up in a religion where masturbation was bad. They couldn't even look at like, girls in their underwear on a magazine. Like all these things were making them feel extreme shame to the point where it's like they started acting out in ways that it's like,
it's like
wonder,
prairie
like
muffins.
Utah's
Like Mormons want people to live like it's the 1800s, like prairie muffins, right? And then you can't live like a prairie muffin in the year 2023 because you're going to be exposed to 2023, which is not 1850,
Yeah.
right? So it's like it's this impossible expectation, and a lot of times that drives people crazy in these really rigid, types of groups. Yeah. So
especially where they can't talk about like their sexuality or
They
any of that
act
kind of
out,
stuff, and
yeah.
then they start
Yeah.
acting out and experimenting on their siblings or whatever it is, and it's like then they are shunned, like they're reprimanded for it and they're abused for it, and like all these different types of things. When you look at the Boy Scouts of America, 1/3 of the Boy Scouts of America were Mormon because it was required by the Mormon religion for all the boys to go through the Boy Scouts, which I thought was very interesting that they required that, because there's already 85,000 claims of
abuse,
child
yeah.
sexual abuse coming
Right.
out of the Boy Scouts. And once that came out public, then the Mormon church decided that, that wasn't going to be a rule anymore. But for a really long time, they required all of the boys in the church to go through Boy Scouts of America. And I thought that's a really interesting thing, because the Boy Scouts of America, they were set up just like the Mormon church, where they didn't come out and actually say that any of this stuff was going on. They handled it in-house, kept everything really secret,
Yeah.
and didn't, get rid of anybody who was being alleged to be abusers or anything like that. So it was kind of like a protected community for abusers, just like the Mormon church.
The cults, yeah, they function. That's what I was trying to say earlier. Is as a perfect sort of network and community for that kind of stuff. Is there any indications as to how wide this is from your research? And then we'll go to the super chats here in a second. Within the structure of Mormon, like, is it supposed to be systemic, or is it like just this area in terms of this specific Hamblin network?
So this actually stems across the country. There's multiple states that are involved. With David Hamblin himself, there's 4 states involved. But what they stated in the victim statements is that this organization, it's not like it's one huge organization. They actually trade and barter with other organizations. So this is more of like a Mormon one that kind of has the inverse religion of the Mormon doctrine,
Mm-hmm.
according to them, but they also, you know, deal with other organizations that are in like human trafficking and other satanic groups, is what they say.
I just remembered too, you guys in the audience, if you remember, we did deep dive into Huxley's Doors of Perception a couple months ago. Do you remember at the end of Doors of Perception? I think this was just for members, but Huxley has a section at the end of Doors of Perception where he's saying that the future religion for America could potentially be the Native American church, and he says that because he thinks that all of the West should be initiated into the mysteries through the promotion of peyote and LSD and all this. And he was one of the key counterculture figures, of course, pushing that for everybody. But it's just interesting that not only did he say that everybody should be initiated into this in Doors of Perception at the end, he specifically identifies the Native American Church, which, I mean, I'm a dude who's studied religious topics for 20 plus years. I didn't even know there was such a thing. I went and looked it up. I didn't know about any of the stuff that you were talking about until you mentioned it. But it made the connection in my mind that that's why he would say it's a perfect vehicle, because there's got to be some kind of shady connections between MK Ultra, there is via Huxley, and the Native American Church. I'm not saying everybody in the Native American Church is a bad person or a mind control person. I'm just saying that a lot of times these groups or these things like that can be tools for how to get drugs to another group, or drugs to mind control people. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's almost like they come in and hijack and use their beliefs or their tools or doctrines in order to administer what it is that they want to administer.
Well, Hamblin was using this to get the peyote and stuff, right? Or was he actually a member of it, or just really close to it? Or
No, he was a member of it.
Oh, but he was a Mormon too.
So I guess the LDS Church of Satan is that the one unique aspect of them is that they can have dual memberships. So they can be a part of the LDS Church. They can also be a part of, the polygamy Native American. And it wasn't until he actually got excommunicated from the Mormon Church that he really dove headfirst into the Native American church. Yeah.
Now you dive a lot deeper into these. Now you said you've done several episodes. Is that just for your paywall people, your paid subscribers?
Yeah. So this case has been a lot of work, and it's also has a really sensitive information. And so I am trying to not put it out there completely to the public, YouTube, all that kind of stuff. So it is behind a paywall. It's on my premium Rockfin channel, rockfin.com/Chiller Queen. I have 5 episodes out. I actually am going to be recording the David Levitt one tomorrow because I'm diving deep into all the alleged members, but everything is taking a ton of research because there's a lot of stuff to go through. And so there's still a lot more episodes coming out. And then I'm also going to be updating people as the court dates occur as well, because nobody knows when the court dates are. People aren't talking about it. Even the local news channels barely say anything about it. So there's really not much information out there on it.
Now, this is, again, a really key case because so many people who want to debunk everything and they're overly skeptical will say that none of this exists, which this case, I think, again, is another one of the big ones that could be looking like it potentially might be another sort of Franklin cover-up type situation. So everybody, if you want to get deeper into her deep dives, head on over to her show. I mean, this was so heavy. I might actually have to move this episode over to Rockfin. It's not a problem. We had a great crowd. We had almost 700 live tonight, which is very cool. So nice. Be sure and follow Avery. We'll go to the super chats now. I've got her links in the show description, and I'll add her Rockfin channel as well. Expendable Empire, $10. Thank you so much. David, $10. This was, I think, from last time. He said, you should read John Hoover, Dr. Turner, Dr. Schmidtke, Dr. Wolfson, and Dr. Ahmed, and Dr. Suleiman, and like 7 doctors I need to read. They have all published a lot of resources on Sunni creedal theology. I appreciate that, David. That is a lot of Sunni creedal theology. AC sends a big fat super chat for our sponsored stream. People are asking, what's the sponsored stream? So I think with Kotel, we're going to do a sponsored stream from our buddy AC on the Buddhist / Neoplatonic philosophy of Vervaeke. And of course, Vervaeke is very close to Peterson. They do a lot of podcasts together, and we've had so many people ask for a deep dive into Vervaeke and the Neoplatonism and Buddhism. So I'll have to dive into Vervaeke. I don't know his ideas that deep, so we'll take a look at that very soon. Anonymous, no wait, we got to go back down. Honeybee, $10 and says nothing. Thank you so much, 00 Honeybee. Anonymous, $5. Do you have any recommended reading on the way that soft kill works. I was reading a book on stabs. So you were probably reading Dr. Mary's Monkey from my publisher. It vindicates your globalist series. Thank you. Yes, a lot of people forget Dr. Mary's Monkey. It's a wild book. That one's a good one. I would just say, I covered Dr. Salk's book. I covered one of them. He's got two: Man Unfolding and Survival of the Wisest. So those are two key books. I think you can find the PDFs, but I don't know if you can find the hard copies. They usually go for like $500 because they're out of print. But I mean, there's a lot of like you could probably look up Dr. Sherry, Tenpenny, big 7-footer, $50. I should have donated this a long time ago. I appreciate your work. Considering how much I appreciate your work. Hey, you and AC won the super chat battle tonight. Big fat super chats. Thank you so much. Big 7-footer. Dr. Chillin, $10. By the way, you guys want to ask Avery a question, feel free to. Keep it within the community guidelines, standards, and all that. Use the super chat function, which is no longer YouTube. It's Streamlabs. The link is there in the chat. What is the relationship to Orthodox versus Septuagint versus Masoretic? Are we allowed to prefer Masoretic in the ESV? So, we're not legalistic about it. There's nothing wrong with reading an ESV. It's not the official textual manuscript of the church. The official textual manuscript of the Old Testament is a Septuagint. However, in the Orthodox Study Bible, they use the Masoretic text in some places for the Gospel of Matthew. So it's not a huge deal, but we certainly don't prefer the Masoretic. We prefer the Septuagint, but you can read other copies. Irina, $25, awesome work. Thank you so much, Irina. Appreciate that so much. Oh, I forgot. Dr. Chillin said, hope you have more debates with Muslims. Yeah, I think there will be one coming up in January. But I might take a break after that from debates. I'm getting kind of worn out on so many debates. Irina, $25. Thank you so much, Irina. Big fat super chat. Really appreciate that. Squidward tennis balls, $2. Thank you for speaking all this truth. Jay, glad that there's a voice like you out there, and glad to have our friend Avery. Great podcast, great information. She keeps it real, even though she covers really, really crazy dark stuff. So everybody go check out her Rockfin and her podcast. And thank you so much for coming back on.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you for having me on.
All right. Have a good night.